name is Linda Braun. I'm actually the Town of Macedon historian, and I'm the secretary with the Macedon Historical Society. And today we're at the Macedon Academy in Macedon Center, New York. We have a panel discussion this afternoon, and the title is, there it is, sorry. Panelist discussion with Rebecca Conklin, a new Quaker who found the community while searching for a group that connected faith work to ongoing social justice issues. She is a member of the Syracuse monthly meeting and the Syracuse representative for the Farmington Scipio Good Trouble and anti-racist group. Her work with this group, along with the draw she felt to Quakerism as a progressive elder millennial, shaped the focus of her remarks today. Then we have Nick Leykin. He's committed his life to nonviolence. He has taken his engineering skills into business, supporting multiple startup companies, including a water filter company, Triton Ceramics, which used water filter technology to build peace between nations. It was a draw to Quakers as a young college student by the fascinating and deep spiritual work that friends in his hometown of Alfred, New York were doing. Some of his work includes Alternatives to Violence Project and Friends Peace Teams. And then we have Jill McClellan today. He's a member of the Buffalo meeting and has been involved in work in state prisons for over 25 years with Alternatives to Violence Project and Quaker meetings. Providing programs inside prisons is an extremely important role, as well as serving as correspondents and visitors to those who are incarcerated. Upon release, positive relationships make a huge difference in reentry to the community. There's room for everyone in this work. And Willie Bontrager cannot be here today, and we'll have a guest speaker for him. Growing up in a Mennonite community, peacemaking was always at the core of Wilbur's spiritual practice. As a conscientious objector to war, he worked in community and agricultural development in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Nigeria during the Vietnam War. Since then, he has been involved in offering hospitality to refugees fleeing war and has facilitated Alternative to Violence Project workshops in Western New York prisons, and is an active member of the New York Quaker Conflict Transformation Committee. In 2000, he graduated with a master's degree from the Center for Justice and Peace at Eastern Mennonite University. He is the founder of Partners in Restorative Initiatives in Rochester, New York. So we're going to begin our panel discussion today with, I think, a little speech from each of our panelists. And why don't we start with Rebecca?
All right, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to all of the other panelists for your good work and willingness to share with us so that we can all learn together. I also want to say thank you to Judy Wellman and Mary-Kay Belant for thinking of me for this panel. When Mary-Kay solicited my participation, I was excited, but I also paused to say, are you sure? Me? And I think that's because I'm rather new to the Quaker community. I began attending the Syracuse Friends meeting in the fall of 2021, shortly after I moved to Syracuse. I became a member at the beginning of this year, and I'm so incredibly thankful for the community and the culture of care that I've been welcomed into as I transition into this new phase of my life. I'm here today as a representative of the Good Trouble group, composed of wonderful friends from the Farmington Scipio regional meeting. The name comes from the call from civil rights activist and Congressman John Lewis, who tweeted in 2018, "Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." The Farmington Scipio Good Trouble group arose out of the call to respond to the New York Yearly Meeting draft minute, becoming an anti-racist faith community. They were waiting for a representative from the Syracuse Friends to join, so I entered an existing group that was organized by the hard work and deep care of other friends in the Farmington Scipio region. I've learned so much from everyone in our group about the history of Quaker faith as it relates to social justice issues, past and present. We meet monthly to discuss how our home meetings are responding to the draft minute and to think more broadly about what anti-racist commitments and action might look like as part of our Quaker faith and practice today. If I might for a moment, I'd like to fill in some of my background that I think speaks to why I became a Quaker in my mid-30s after a life as an atheist with little need for the conventions of an organized religion or faith community. I was raised atheistic, which I mean literally, not as an atheist, which does have its own sort of doctrine, but really without any kind of religion or faith practice at all. I didn't go to any space of faithful worship growing up, and if I'm being honest, I felt a little sorry for my friends who had to go to church Sunday morning when I could stay home and watch cartoons. As I grew up and learned more about the history of the world I found myself in, I developed a deep skepticism of religion. It seemed difficult to square the harm caused by violent movements such as the Crusades and colonialism with a message of peace and love for all. While my home didn't forward religion or faith, my parents taught me a lot about what I now call social justice. My mom, who is with me today, has been a social worker for all of her life, and those values of helping others and seeking to build a more just, equitable, and free society for all have been deeply ingrained in my consciousness and my heart. I've always sought spaces that allow me to connect to this and make actionable my beliefs that my belief that we all have a part to contribute to making the world a better place. For the last 5 years, I've been working on my PhD in rhetoric and writing, and my area of research is the concept of ambiguity. This work has fundamentally changed how I think about a lot of things. It's cracked open a space for me to consider faith from an entirely different perspective than I had throughout my life. In short, to think that God or spirit doesn't exist is as much of an absolute as to think that it does. I found myself in the middle and was looking for a way to explore this without dogma or restriction. And with my ongoing concern for social justice, I knew that if I decided to seek out a community to explore this, they too would need to have a sense of care for the equity and freedom of others. Quakerism felt like the ideal fit of these two concerns, and the incredible members of our Syracuse meeting, who have throughout their lives fought in various ways for peace and justice, affirmed for me that I had found my people. The rest of what I've written today, I kind of think is a meditation on what history means and can mean for us today. And I think that to truly understand the importance of anti-racist work today, we have to see ourselves in this country in a really clear and honest reflection of our history. It is ugly and painful, and the fact that there is no way to go back and change things only deepens this pain. But what we have to do now is take the context of our history as a guide to see the good work we need to do today and the good, necessary trouble, to quote John Lewis, that we have to make in order to bring forth change. Early in my days with the Good Trouble group, a fellow member invited me to attend another group of friends from around the country who were together reading this lofty tome, Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, Quakers, African Americans, and the Myth of Racial Justice, written by Donna McDaniel and Vanessa Julie, and published in 2009. It's split into two parts. The first considers Quaker history during enslavement, emancipation, and the movement west, and the second focuses on more modern issues of desegregation, Quaker schooling, economic justice, and nonviolence, all as they relate to race and ideology in Quaker faith. If you have not read this book, please, please, please do. There's also like a study guide PDF that's available on the Friends website that's much shorter and a little bit easier entry, but still has the main ideas that this text has. I firmly believe that to be relevant to the present, we have to deeply and honestly understand our past. This is particularly true for white folks in this moment as we discuss anti-racist work, since we have inherited privileges that span back to the horrendously unjust foundations of our country. Many friends in this book group who have been Quakers far longer than myself were shocked, surprised, hurt by some of the history that is captured in the book. As a collective, Quakers have been some of the more peaceable people throughout the founding and subsequent history of our country. But not everyone was on the same page. Not all Quakers agreed on issues that seem so painfully clear to us now, including enslavement. As I read these accounts and worked through some of that discomfort, I found myself coming back to the same question. What are our equivalents today? By this I mean, what is going to seem so painfully clear to future generations that we seem conflicted or perhaps ambivalent about today? Sometimes, when we try to look at a painful past, we fall into what I think is an emotional fallacy more than a logical fallacy. We think, wow, those were bad times. Those were bad ethics. Those were bad practices. As if it's over, as if it doesn't still echo today, as if there aren't new bad times, new bad ethics, new bad practices. Or maybe they aren't new at all, but rather sneaky evolutions of the original forms that we no longer easily recognize. I think if we aren't trying to connect history to the equivalents today, history loses its power to change the future. You know what I just said, that one of the painful things about history is that we can't change it. We can't go back into the past and change it, and that's true. But history can change the present, and it can change the future. We just have to be radical enough, vulnerable enough, and honest enough to see our world as if it were someone else's history. Because it is, because it will be. And from there, we can start to see things from a different perspective. One that allows us to span between hundreds of years in the past, hundreds of years in the future, and see ourselves here, in this moment, both as the inheritors of something that we did not create, while also creating something that others will inherit. We don't all have to do the same thing to address our current problems, and no one person can do everything. Our problems may be large, but perhaps our solutions can begin small. We can start right where we are, in our homes, our schools, our faith communities, our regional communities, and ask, what good trouble needs to be made here? Making good trouble is uncomfortable, particularly for white folks who are enculturated to avoid conflict and to maintain a sense of comfort. This is true too, to some extent, in Quakerism. For example, as is documented in Fit for Freedom, Quakers have been disowned for their vocal dissent against what they saw as oppression. We can tell ourselves that we're not like that today, that Quaker faith is more open and less punitive. But what I'm suggesting here is that if we take as a beginning point the question, what is our equivalent today, and what kind of good trouble does it call for? I appreciate having the opportunity to share my perspective of a new Quaker who is drawn to the faith because it provided avenues for both spiritual deepening and expanding commitments to the broad projects of social justice as Quakers are called today. I really look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and to questions and discussions after. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. Do we want to listen to everybody first and then do questions, or would you like to ask questions in between? Well, I saw some nods. We'll listen to everybody? All right, we'll go forward with that then. Thank you.
Yeah, write down your questions, so you know where we're going. So, hello everyone, I'm Nick Leykin, and I'm a member of Genesee Valley monthly meeting. There are some people from my meeting here today, and I've also been worshiping with the Rochester meeting, and I just bought a house in Rochester, moved to Rochester, and the task today was to talk about alternatives to violence, and specifically Alternatives to Violence Project, which is the organization. And I want to do that, and then I want to sort of connect it to the rest of my life. I think it's important to put things in context. And the most basic thing is to start with what is Alternatives to Violence Project. So Alternatives to Violence Project usually is a series of workshops, and the workshops are experiential. So people show up together and basically build a community, build trust with one another, have shared experiences, and often try and solve a conflict together as a group, and find new insights, maybe develop new tools as well. And all of those workshops are facilitated, and each facilitator is also a participant. Everyone's part of a community. And the sort of makeup of these workshops is activities. So there might be brainstorms, there might be motion activities where people get up and do things, and then there's often time for reflection and insight. Alternatives to Violence Project is really active in prisons and also active in communities as well outside of the walls of prison. And it's also equally important to think about the history of Alternatives to Violence Project. It started in the 70s in Greenhaven Prison. There were prisoners there who were noticing that as sort of a revolving door of prisoners and people who they knew from their communities coming in to be incarcerated, and they thought, wow, there's got to be a better way, and like our community needs new tools. And so they thought, wow, we should work while we're inside and we have this time on ourselves, and we should then take that out into the community that we come from and that we're part of, and actually work on ways of shifting the narrative and shifting away from violence as the solution to the problems. The core fundamental belief is that conflict happens, conflict maybe isn't bad, but that using violence to solve conflict is not good. There are a number of people in the room who have alternatives to violence experience. Jill here on the panel.
Tons of people out there.
Tons of people out there as well. And everyone has their own activity. For me, I haven't done much since before the pandemic. It's been hard to get a community workshop together. But I've also done work in prisons, Groveland Prison, Elmira Prison, and then I ran like a Alternatives to Violence Project group in Alfred, New York, and did that for a number of years. I think, what else? I guess,
Can you talk about the success of the program?
yes, thank you. I think that one example of success is that in moving to Rochester, I've been looking for where to volunteer and how to meet new people and how to be part of community. And the first place I went was the Gandhi Institute, and there were people at the table that I knew from inside Groveland. And if that's, that's community building, and if that's the major takeaway from the work that I've done with Alternatives to Violence Project, that's very meaningful to me. To find people like now in their home that I live in, the community that they're part of, and to have an instant connection that goes back for years has value. For me, like there are personal effects, like I have lots of opportunities where I'm able to solve conflicts non-violently, and it surprises both me and often the people that I'm in conflict with. And I think that just in general, like building communities and building strength and finding new tools and ways to be in community and in conflict is a deeper, better society. And so I'm happy to be part of that. So I want to connect this to the other parts of my life. You know, I'm an engineer, and I like to make things and make things better. And I think of that as sort of an excuse to do things with people. Like, I do engineering, but I'm really interested in the people. And so I've started multiple companies, and the first one I wrote in here is Triton Ceramics. It's a water filter company. The idea is to go overseas and bring some of the technology that we have here to people who need it overseas, so into Indonesia. And when you show up in Indonesia, now people know someone from the United States. And now I know people from Indonesia. And we become a smaller, closer, safer, more peaceful world in that way. Equally important to mention is that I'm a war tax resistor. I don't pay for the military portion of the federal budget. That's not legal. You're not allowed to do it. It's very, very important to me, so I don't do it. Going back to engineering work, like right now I make lights, and some of the devices that the company is spending a lot of time on is targeted towards the military. They want to make displays that are inside the helmet, and I just went to them and I said, yep, I work for you, and I'm not going to work on that. And I'm taking a religious exemption, and I can't participate. And it was surprising. Like, my veteran boss, who's a Vietnam vet and loves guns and the military, got it and was very encouraging and supportive, which was very surprising. And we've mentioned John Lewis. And John Lewis, up until the time of his death, had introduced every year the Peace Fund tax bill, an actual legal way for you to not pay for the military and pay for war. And just to be brief so that we have a chance to do discussion, which is more valuable to me, I also am looking for alternatives to violence in my community involvement. You know, I saw someone out in front who I thought was trying to steal a car, and like, how do I respond to that? And also with my family, like, I'm married, and I want to solve my conflicts with my partner in positive, peaceful ways that that build us stronger. So I think that's enough for now, unless there's something else that's burning that I should say. Thank you, everyone.
Are you doing Willie next or me next? Okay. Gotta get this right. So I'm Jill McClellan from Buffalo Meeting, and I really hate microphones, but I'm going to use it because I know you need it for the technology. So Quakers have been hanging out in prison for a very long time. First of all, Quakers were put in prison for their beliefs or refusing to take off their hats or do various things. And the first prison volunteer that anybody knows of was Elizabeth Fry, who went into prison either in 1812 or 1813. There's different accounts. But she was a Quaker, a wealthy Quaker, who believed in taking care of everyone. And she went into Newgate prison first, found deplorable conditions, women and men and children all thrown in together with, you know, no sanitation, nothing to do, all kinds of horrible conditions. And the amazing thing is she started spending the night in prison. And so she spent the night in a number of prisons to really get a feel for what was going on. And she concentrated first on the children, trying to get them books and clothing and stuff like that. And then she ended up teaching the women, like sewing and other household skills. And anyway, she did that for her whole life. And she also worked with people with mental health issues and all kinds of other things. So I thought that was cool. So, oh, and the other thing is the prisons after Attica, the uprising in 1971, the prisons in New York State, well, I don't want to say they had a change of heart because I don't think it quite happened that way, but the conditions were highlighted. And so a lot of programs that were not happening in prison, it was part of the things that the men were asking for, they slowly started. So Quakers first started worshiping in Auburn in 1974. AVP started in Greenhaven in 1975, and then also in Auburn in 1975. So that was a really big opening to get more people into prison. And I'll talk about that a little bit, but I want to say we have since seen a decline. Things that we were allowed to do are no longer allowed, and it seems to get more and more punitive. So we'll talk about that with good trouble and some other things. But I started going into prison in probably the early 90s. My husband, John, if you'll raise your hand, we went in to an event, a religious event in Auburn, and met a lot of really interesting people. And at that time, I had little kids, and I didn't become a volunteer for a few years. But it was a really amazing experience. And at one point, this gentleman came over and offered to get me some tea or coffee. And I started to say, oh no thanks, I can get it myself. And my friend kicked me and said, how often does he get to be a host? And I thought, right. So I was hooked. And I want to tell you about this man who offered to get us tea and coffee. And the last year, he came home after 40 years of being in prison. He had special needs, attended special ed classes all through school, and I'm sure he's in prison because he had special needs and he followed what someone asked him to do. But the good news is he's living in a shelter. He calls us, he sends us cards, he's taking some job training, and he's reunited with his family, who he didn't visit him the whole time he was inside. As a matter of fact, he only had a few visitors in the whole 40 years he was inside. Which brings me to one point, is that that's a really important thing that Quakers do, is visit people. We tend to visit people that we know through AVP or Quaker meeting or whatever, but it is huge because a lot of people have lost their family connections. Yet, the studies show that a strong family connection is one way that you can be sure that they have a good chance of making it on the outside. So back to my becoming a volunteer. I became a volunteer in about 95. Started doing workshops in prison, which were 3 days long. And the thing that I love the best about AVP is everything is done by a team. And the team is made up of people who come from the outside, and men or women who live inside the walls. And so that in itself is like an amazing thing, because even though the power differential is great, on that team, everybody's equal. And in lots of cases, the men and women inside know a heck of a lot more than I do. And so I need to defer to them. If they say this is the way to go, I'm like, I'm sure it is. We trying to think of I first went into prison, a big issue was homophobia. It tends to be the things that society is dealing with seem to be a little slower to take hold in prison. So, you know, while the rest of society was looking at same-gender marriage and all kinds of other things, in prison, they really weren't there. And so that was really interesting to explore. And then, racism was often a topic. Sexism was an interesting topic because I was often the only woman in a workshop. And, I felt like it was hard to explain kind of what was going on. As probably everybody knows, there are far more people in prison who are brown and black. Far more in the States, particularly where there are a lot of Native Americans. The Native American population is very large in prison. And so already you see, oh, something's wrong here. Let's see, I also go in for a Quaker meeting. I've been going into Auburn for, 27, 28 years. And I love going in to worship in prison. The clerk is a person who lives in prison. Most of the people who attend are people who live in prison. And we're fortunate to be able to come in from the community and join them. But we're not in charge. We're not, we're just there to be members of the meeting. And so a lot of things happen that happen in a regular Quaker meeting, like having a discussion and leading a program and having a business meeting, having a retreat, all those kind of things. And so that's been a huge part of my life, is attending the Quaker meeting in Auburn, and then at 5 Points for a while, and then Orleans for about 5 or 6 years. The wonderful news about Orleans is they're all home. And so I don't need to go there anymore because I can see them at a Quaker meeting, or I can see them on Zoom, or in the community. So one thing that I'm really happy about is our yearly meeting has a prisons committee, and our region, Farmington Scipio, also has a prisons committee. And one thing we're able to do is help people who come home. Help them with finances, help them with whatever, housing, cars, getting a driver's license, warm clothing. We helped buy furniture for a man who came home during the pandemic, got a job where he needed to work online, and all the thrift stores were closed and he couldn't get a table and chair. So, just really, really basic things. And so that's been really gratifying that we've been able to help people. Let's see. Okay, the other thing is, like I said in my little bio, is there's a place for everyone. So some people maybe could write a letter. They're Quakers, there's a really great inside-outside correspondence program. But you can also look online, and there are people who write to death row, people that write to various, like they write to young prisoners or young people who are incarcerated. And if you're able to make a visit to someone that, is maybe recommended to you as somebody who really doesn't have any family. And the other thing is is just welcoming people who come home, welcoming them to your community, to your Quaker meeting, to your church, to your food bank, to whatever, because that's a huge step. And a lot of people in New York have served very long sentences. So imagine being in prison 40 years, 50 years, coming home and looking at a cell phone, or, trying to apply for a job online. And one last thing is I wanted to talk about language. And that's that for lots of years, I've tried to always have people first language. So when I taught kids with autism, they were that, kids with autism. And so words like inmate and offender and convict and stuff, I don't use those words. I use people who live in prison or someone who's incarcerated or whatever. And the best thing to do, is ask someone how they'd like to be referred to. The Department of Corrections has recently changed it from, it used to be inmate, now it's offender, then it was offender, and now it is incarcerated person. So they're getting there. But, thanks for letting me talk. I hope there are lots of good questions. And now it's Willie standing.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here, and thank you to our panelists. I can't wait to hear the discussion. My name is Mary-Kay Belant, and I'm here with the privilege of getting to read some of Willie Bontrager's words. He unfortunately wasn't able to be here today. It's for a happy reason. There's a joyful event in his family's life, but he was deeply sorry not to be able to be here with us also. So here is what Willie wanted me to share. There are several aspects about Quaker belief and practice that are attractive to me, such as the testimonies: simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, stewardship, and the concept of the inner light, or that part of God in every person. The last 25 years I have focused on how to attain peace when in conflict with others or within a community. All of us have an understanding of, desire for, or can visualize what peace would look like when in conflict. Conflict is a normal part of relationships. Conflict is an instigator and motivator for change. It can have either a positive or negative outcome. How do you change negative aspects of a community, such as violence, prejudice, racism, and misunderstanding, to a model community where different faith traditions work for positive social change of mutual understanding and cooperation? During the process of social change, conflict almost always develops. Some present-day examples are the issues of climate change, healthcare, immigration, and of course the effects and after effects of what happened on January 6, 2021. Conflict is a normal part of human relationships. If conflict is normal, how can faith communities and Quakers embrace conflict as a motor for change and avoid the unintended consequences, hardening attitudes of clinging to existing social norms and driving communities farther apart, which is happening in our present national climate? Sometimes it is necessary to instigate conflict in order to achieve constructive social change. For example, the civil rights movement in the 60s. Caroline A. Westerhoff said, "Conflict is a gift. It is not a price to be paid and endured, but a condition to be sought and welcomed and nurtured. To manage conflict, then, would be to allow it, not to suppress it, to open our doors and windows to its fresh wind." Following this line of thought to its ultimate conclusion, violence and war become not conflict run amok, conflict out of bounds, grounds, but the final outcome of conflict quelled. Close quote. I approach conflict and social change through the ethical and religious lens of an Anabaptist, Mennonite, and Quaker. This perspective believes peace arises out of conflict when the emphasis is on the importance of building right relationships and social structures to achieve justice. As a peace activist and advocate, I have observed 3 different paradigms, types, or aspects of working for peace. Number 1, peacekeepers. When a conflict is unresolved, there is a need for opposing sides to be separated in order to keep peace. Number 2, peacemakers or peace managers. Making peace between 2 or more parties, such as in conflict resolution, when an issue has been successfully mediated. Number 3, peace builders. Building a framework or structure for peace that is long-lasting and will make a positive change in attitudes and social patterns or norms. My focus will be on peace building. My views on justice and peace are based on one of my favorite Bible verses, Micah chapter 6, verse 8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love, mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? This verse requires action, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. We need to understand the biblical concept of justice, mercy, and humility. For true justice to occur, these 3 actions cannot be separated. A comprehensive proposal on how to achieve true justice and positive social change is beyond our scope today, but I will offer up 2 concepts that have potential: conflict transformation and restorative justice. I think both of these concepts offer a path toward peace through positive social change and the potential to change a person's heart. These 2 concepts are what I have been promoting for the last 25 years. This will be a long journey. Conflict transformation, according to John Paul Lederach, quote, is based on 2 realities. Conflict is normal in human relationships and is a motor for change, close quote. It can move from being destructive to being constructive. It directs us toward change and moves from conflict to right relationships. It emphasizes the importances of building right relationships and social structures through a radical respect for human rights, says John Paul Lederach. It goes beyond conflict resolution to view conflict as an opportunity for deeper relations. It looks into past history, deals with the present and its environment, seeks the underlying causes of conflict, and builds a framework for future peace. The center of this transformational approach is bringing together the relational aspect, which views conflict as an opportunity, and the development of creative change processes that will increase justice and reduce violence. It views peace as being centered and rooted in healthy human relationships. The concept of conflict transformation is closely aligned with or is the foundation of restorative justice. Conflict transformation understands that peace is embedded in justice. It is the desire to work toward changing the elements of society that are perpetuating conflicts and violence. I recently helped a faith community move on from a conflict that had been simmering for 24 years. I used peacemaking circles as a way of dealing with this conflict. This happened during the COVID crisis, which necessitated meeting on Zoom. They walked through the hurts and pain of past experiences and were able to move into right relationships. I call it walking through the fire. Conflict is like quack grass. If you only pull the grass, it will resurface in another area. You need to dig out the roots or runners to eliminate the grass. What is restorative justice? The paradigm of restorative justice started with an effort to deal with crime, but has evolved beyond that. There are many different ways in which it has been implemented. It has been used in schools, businesses, dealing with community conflict and community building, and in many other settings. Since Quakers have traditionally been involved with criminal justice issues, I will focus on that aspect of restorative justice. According to Howard Zare, our present justice system views crime as a violation of the law, and the state views that violations create guilt. States that justice requires the state to determine blame or guilt and impose pain or punishment. Its central focus is for offenders to get what they deserve. The paradigm of restorative justice views crime or wrongdoing is a violation of people and relationships. Violations create obligations. Justice involves victims, offenders, and community members in an effort to repair the harm or to make things right as much as possible. The central focus is the victim's needs and offenders' responsibility for meeting those needs and repairing the harm. The questions are different for each. The criminal justice system asks, 1, what laws were broken? 2, who did it? 3, what do they deserve? Restorative justice asks, 1, who has been harmed? 2, what are their needs? And 3, whose obligations are these to fulfill their needs? If crime is essentially about harm, accountability means being encouraged to understand that harm and to comprehend the consequences of one's behavior. Moreover, it means taking responsibility to make things right insofar as possible, both concretely and symbolically. As our foreparents knew, wrong creates obligations. Taking responsibility for those obligations is the beginning of genuine accountability. This last was a quote from Howard Zare. What would a different justice system look like? What would our present justice system look like if it were called the victim justice system instead of the criminal justice system? What would happen if the focus switched from the offender to the needs of victims? Restorative justice is not a matter of adding a new program to or of tinkering with old ones. It involves a reorientation of how we think about conflict, crime, or wrongdoing, and justice. Restorative justice begins with a concern for victims and how to meet their needs resulting from the harm caused by the offense. I see language here. So the offender should be accountable to the victim and the community, not to the state, except for cases where community safety is threatened. Both the victim and the offender are active participants in a restorative justice process. When a community can draw on and trust its own inner resources to discover the validity of a new paradigm, the community is liberated from bondage to old, embedded, fixated ways of being in the world. The community is then able to embrace the creativity of chaos, the possibility of dreams. People are empowered to imagine new ways of being, to problem solve on a deep level. In this way, a community can truly take hold of its future and its past. Together, the gathered people can soar with their dreams, weep over their losses, and be free to gather together beyond differences of opinion. This last was a quote from Kay Pronis. President Eisenhower said, "Peace and justice are two sides of the same coin. Justice requires accountability to self, to others, and to the wider community. I encourage you to seriously consider implementing conflict transformation and restorative justice practices in your life and community. The 1816 Farmington Friends Meeting House has the potential for being an avenue for social change and peace like it was over a century ago." Eleanor Roosevelt said, "It isn't enough to talk about peace, one must believe in it, and it isn't enough to believe in it, one must work at it." Thank you for listening. Willie Bontrager.
Mary-Kay can stay and answer any questions we might have. I think that's a good idea. Sorry. So I apologize for tripping over the title of this panel earlier today. contemporary Quakers' witness to peace and justice. And I think that's what we just saw, each of you sharing your personal feelings and experiences with all of us. So does anybody have any questions? What we'll do, because again, we're streaming, I'll repeat your question. And if you have somebody in particular to answer, you can ask.
I wrote down questions for everyone.
Would you like?
I don't have to read them all in order, just to fill in after everybody else asks questions too.
Well, I'd love to have your list of questions. Is it, we've got to record it?
Sure. Oh, I have to use the microphone? Oh, great.
Well, it's only so long, so I thought.
Oh, great. Well, I feel like I'm talking now. My name is Corey. I moved to Rochester about 10 years ago, and I'm from Oklahoma, southwestern Oklahoma. So, Miss, you're talking about, being atheist and everything, and then coming to, Quakerism. And excuse me for I wasn't raised, too well. So if I speak things a little weird, I apologize. I mean, no offense. Rebecca, right? Okay. So first I want to thank you for having printed material, because I'm a little hard of hearing as well, so that was really nice. And you saying watching cartoons and stuff, that was really funny, because all the places that I worked at, I was always the one working on Sundays because I didn't go to church either. So with you knowing more about the religion and everything, kind of being aware of that, looking at Saturday morning cartoons and television and stuff like that, how have you kind of seen some similarities with the religion and maybe some hidden messages and kind of things that you would kind of prefer people to kind of maybe watch and kind of relate to that is similar to things that you've experienced and now know as with being Quaker aside from atheism? Turn this off now.
I want to make sure I understand your question too.
Sure.
So are you, is this one on? Yes, okay, hello. I hear myself in stereo. Are you asking what cultural references there are for Quakerism, or I'm not sure I quite grasped.
Just some cartoons and stuff like that. I'm an animator as well, so with animations and stuff like that, there's always different messages, kind of adult, maybe humor and cartoons and stuff like that. So since you were raised with cartoons and stuff like that, looking back now, what are some things that this actually had this kind of message, and would you kind of refer people to, anything even modern that kind of triggers something,
I fear I have overstated my love of cartoons.
I am heartbroken.
Let me think for one moment, because I was not, of all the questions that I tried to anticipate, I like yours, but it was not one.
I apologize. I hosted open mic too,
do not
all of you are going to
apologize.
get some good
Do
questions.
not apologize. I'm going to tell you just what's coming to my mind, which is actually a take that I heard from a TikToker. So I watch TikTok, which I don't know whether or not that's very Quakerly, but I do it a lot. And forgive me, I don't know if you know about TikTok, but it's just videos, and you can scroll through them for hours, and you can see 500 people in 30 minutes, and it's a strange place, but I like it very much. And a creator on TikTok, who of course I don't remember because you see 500 people in 30 minutes, was talking about the show Rugrats. Does anyone remember the cartoon Rugrats? And was talking about how if you watch Rugrats as an adult now, you will recognize that it was an incredibly progressive show for the 90s. And it was progressive in a way where it didn't need to name itself or self-congratulate. So there were interracial couples, there were gay couples, there were adopted children, there were international families. There was just all this going on in this small town of a community of people that learned and knew how to get together and be together in community. And I wasn't like reading critical media studies when I was 8, but this was what I was absorbing in that time. And I think it kind of fits with this notion of history, that history is always more complex than we think it is. We think that we're always becoming more progressive in some ways, but we take steps forward and we take steps back and we take steps forward. And I think that there was something going on in the 90s when us elder millennials were children, that was a bit more progressive, and again, didn't state itself in such a way that it was like, this is for a political reason. It was just like, this is the media that we're creating and you're consuming. And I think, I don't know, I'm sure some media studies person, of which I'm not, has an answer to this. What happened to that time in the 90s of children's cartoons and other media that sort of changed? And I think we're coming back around, but that type of media now is much more self-aware. It's like, we're doing this for a political reason, which isn't, it's not that's good and this is bad or anything like that. It's just interesting to think about, and that is my answer. Is Rugrats.
That's a great
Rugrats.
answer.
If you didn't check it out now.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that, but you're right. There's so many different examples, and I totally forgot about that until you mentioned all those points. So growing up in southwestern Oklahoma, so right by Texas, I remember growing up and not being able to watch Sesame Street because one of the voice actors was gay. So, again, like the animations and stuff like that, like I really think that there is a really strong connection to kind of maybe talk more about that and stuff like that. That's something that interests me. And yeah, thank you, that was really great.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, and again, if anybody has any questions along the line, I feel like everybody here knows everybody.
Should I go?
Oh yeah, this is all yours.
For the people working on AVP, Jill, I gotta say you are one of my heroes. I've never told you this, but I'm sitting here thinking it's about time. After knowing you for 30 years, it's about time I told you. You're such an inspiration. But you had mentioned that things may be getting worse in New York State prisons and tightening up. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, when I first started volunteering in prison, one thing that we could do is we could visit someone who was in a prison where we didn't volunteer. So on the way to Silver Bay, where the Quakers meet in the summer, I would take my kids and we would go visit people. And as a matter of fact, Joseph, the man I was talking about, we visited him then up at Great Meadow. And then they changed the rules, so if you were a volunteer, you couldn't visit or correspond or take phone calls from anybody who was incarcerated anywhere in the New York State system. So then we used to be able to be spiritual advisors, so a couple of us could respond to someone who asked for a visit. And we would usually go in pairs, and we would go visit people either in the prisons where we volunteer or some other prison where someone asked for Quakers to visit. And they stopped allowing volunteers to do that. So like someone else could go visit, but the thing was that the volunteers who knew the people who were asking for the visit were known to them. So that was hard. Now recently a bunch of hubs which is a group of prisons in a geographical area, have restricted packages. And so the rule is that you have to, the people who live in prison would need to order online or, mail order food and things that their families used to be able to visit, bring when they visited or send. And I will admit to something right now, because I don't think anybody will relay this to the Department of Corrections, but when John visited someone, we would go to Wegmans and get lots of bags and fill those bags with our produce. We have a produce stand, so we could say it actually came from a local stand, and he could take those peppers and onions and carrots and tomatoes and all those things in. And that, under these new rules, that won't be allowed anymore. And so the other thing that's a great worry is we weren't allowed to go in during the pandemic. And then when they said we could come back, they have been very slow to allow volunteers back in. And my thinking is the correction officers probably got kind of used to no volunteers being there. And maybe they liked it, and maybe they didn't, but it was a lot easier probably without volunteers. Because we have eyes and ears and we see what's going on. And so those are just a couple examples of things that I see as getting more punitive.
You can add to that. I had one observation, and so I'll ask a question. We talk a lot about the incarcerated, the person who, assuming they committed the act. I was glad to hear Mary-Kay talk about the victim, because that's kind of where my brain is. Well, what about the victim? And not that we shouldn't assist other people, but who's assisting the victim? And I wonder if you had any thoughts, are there any programs that do that? Other than maybe it's the conflict resolution part. And have you figured out a way to solve all the problems in the city of Rochester? Every other day, every day. It's quite I lived there for 25 years, and I was at a graduation last night, and I have never been scared in the city, and I was last night. And I felt so bad about it, because I'm watching every corner, because sirens are going down this street, down that street, and it's difficult to see what's happened in the last couple of years. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
I can say something. Mary-Kay, you put about the September program with the Gandhi Institute and the...
Yes, and I'm going to ask if there, the programs that are the brochures that were handed around, and I hope you all have one of them, has a little insert in it. And yes, those. So please pick one up if you don't already have one, and there's a little insert in it that has just a brief title of each of our programs for each month going forward. And one of them is in September. I think it's September 24th, and it will be at the Wood Library, and it is about restorative justice. And do I have Willie's? Okay, so Willie organized that panel, and so it would be wonderful if you all could attend that and come with more questions and get to experience maybe an answer to what you're talking about, or to more addressing of it anyway. Do other panelists up here have anything to say to that?
I want to try and answer the question about. So I just moved to the city of Rochester, and there was a question about, or there was just mention of, I think, the violence in the city of Rochester, and yeah, it's very concerning. And I'd say the most important thing is that we think about it, we talk to one another about it, and that we ask ourselves, what are we doing that supports this violence, and what are we doing to erode it? for me, like moving to a neighborhood that was mixed race was step one. Like I can't listen to the needs of my entire community when I live in a highly protected white space, like, for example, East Aurora, New York, or Orchard Park, New York. These are places I've lived where they've done a lot of work to keep people of color out. And yeah, I think, you know, it's a beautiful place to live. I like being there, and it has a bright future ahead of it. And nothing new is happening right now. Like, people have been killed for a long time. Maybe more people are being killed right now. Gun violence is spiking up. But it's the roots of this moment in Rochester go back to the beginning of Rochester. And to undo it will take a while, and I want to be part of it. I'm excited to find the future. So thank you for mentioning it.
How are we on time?
We're good. We're looking to end around 4, so maybe one last question.
If there's a question, it's to myself. Further reflection and building on what Nick just shared. My name's Lyle. I was born and brought up in Ontario County in a very rural area. I'm now living in a very urban neighborhood of Rochester. I've lived with gun violence all my life. I didn't realize until adulthood how scared I was of all the crazy hunters where I grew up as a kid and didn't dare go out during hunting season because of all the hunting accidents. That doesn't dismiss or diminish the peak of gun violence that we're dealing with in Rochester and so many other places. But it gives a little bit of broader context as I feel what wells up in me. I feel much safer walking in the neighborhoods where I've lived in Rochester, including a very multiracial Susan B. Anthony Historic District, than I did living on a road where my family's home was the only house in sight. That doesn't diminish the reality of gun violence that we're all concerned about, but it gives me a little more context to put it in. And as for sirens, I have to remind myself every time I hear a siren in Rochester, it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has just shot somebody else. It might be the ambulance going to save somebody who's had a heart attack. It might be any number of situations responding to a domestic violence dilemma, which is urban, rural, and everywhere in between. I don't know. It's very conflicting. It's very disturbing. I'm thinking of Elizabeth O'Connor and her desire for 8th day of creation. I would like to create another day between today and tomorrow and take all of you and everyone who's listening and will hear us on YouTube and wherever else to the George Eastman Museum to see the very last day of a photography exhibit by Joshua Rashad McFadden, who was born in 1990, raised in Rochester. His grandfather worked for and retired from Kodak, and this kid had a camera in his hand from about age 3, I think. And the display at the Church Eastman Museum by this African-American, now self-affirming gay man, and his delving into the social fabric that we're all a part of. We've all been woven into it with our white privilege or not. Words fail me. I wish you could all experience what I've experienced in that exhibit. And I think building on what I heard Nick say a moment ago, recognizing the art and the beauty and the spiritual presence of folks like Joshua McFadden, and exposing ourselves to that, and not just listening to the 2-minute news headlines of, oh, there's been another shooting, helps us feel more connected to the entire family, and maybe helps with the fear, which we're all feeling and wanting to move through. Words fail, but thank you all for bringing your examples and your life experience as challenges to me.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who presented this afternoon, and for the audience, and for those of you at home. And we do appreciate the jointure we have between our two organizations, and thank you for helping us out today. And